It is now my pleasure to introduce Allison Silva. She's the Managing Director of the Orphan Group, and she's also the Chief Operating Officer at Sunlogic. And also joining her today is Bharat Charida. He is the new president coming on board for Sunlogic as well. And we're so pleased to be able to have both of them join us today for Show Me the Money. So great topic to be talking about this afternoon, and please help me welcome Allison and Bharat.
Hello? Okay. It just didn't like me. Bharat and I are thrilled to be here this afternoon, and we'd like to thank the organizers of the conference, Nicole and Kim and Carrie, Barbara, and all the others for hosting this wonderful patient summit, as well as tomorrow night's Tribute to Champions of Hope Gala. If you haven't been to tomorrow night's function, it's just impressive and moving on all levels, so you'll really have a great time there. When I was asked to do this presentation, Show Me the Money, my response to Nicole was, well, this should be about 5 minutes, and then we can all go outside and sit by the pool. Where to go and when to ask for it, go everywhere, ask for it always and often. So for Friday afternoon after lunch, and when the view out there is much prettier, you can feel free to wrap up quickly here. But in all seriousness, Bharat and I today will take you through some main points of our successes in raising money. We'll utilize the Global Genes Drug Development Roadmap that was put together, and we'll highlight our additions to it and how we've seen successes at each stage. I've described briefly, but I'll let Bharat introduce himself, your hosts. I've been in rare disease drug development for about 15 years, several different biotech startups, as well as an orphan drug consulting company, which has allowed me to gain access to some amazing programs, really get a breadth of experience working in all sections of rare disease drug development. So I'm thrilled to be able to help in any way. Bharat, as Kim mentioned, just joined my company as president, or will join on Monday, has an extensive history at Auspex, Addix, Cerna, Merck, Nectar, so he has a lot of end-stage experience, M&A, public markets access, while my experience is a little bit earlier working with academics and venture capitalists, venture philanthropy. So we're happy to bring together those sections of financing and hopefully cover any of your questions. Our agenda today is we'll just briefly outline the social and economic landscape of orphan drug development. You all sitting in this room are here because you know this better than I do, but we thought we would just baseline everyone and remind you why we're doing this. We'll take you through the drug development roadmap that Global Genes put together, the basic research and discovery phase, preclinical research, clinical research, and then distribution and access. And then we'll go to the question of access to capital, the how, what, where, and when. And then we thought we'd finish up the discussion with our case studies, our most recent case studies. So I'll talk a little bit about the funding history of Sunlogic, and Bharat is going to discuss with you his recent 18-month takeover and sale of Auspex, which was just phenomenal. Okay, so there's a lot of words on this slide that you don't need to focus on, but really all of you know this in the room. There's been this social and economic motivation continuum to progress the development of rare diseases and orphan drugs. Rare diseases continue to present a global public health crisis and increased media scrutiny, relentless patient advocacy on your part. So really their drive is there, and I believe that people are listening. I believe that people are listening at a government level as well as an investor level and a payer and physician level. So I think that we all sit here in this room knowing that there's a lot more that needs to be done and a lot more support that needs to be garnered, but it has been heard at a lot of levels, and I think that the makings of a lot of success in this field are there. The ERDRC campaign to have 200 new rare disease therapeutics on the market by 2020 is something that's been taken seriously. This movement has been a global movement, with the European Commission contributing 150 million euros for the funding of orphan drug development. If you read on this slide, the impact is so extensive. 30 million Europeans, 26 research projects in 29 countries. The orphan drug development campaign in the US has also been significant. I think you are all probably familiar with NIH's NCATS, the National Center for Advancing Translational Science, their Trend and Bridge program, to really have this translational accelerator program in place to help guide programs that have been deprioritized by big pharma and give them a chance to really come to life in the orphan field. NIH is a huge supporter of rare diseases. This year they'll fund $3.5 billion in research. And then just a few data points on the economics of orphan drug development. So the forecasted growth from 2014 to 2020 is expected to increase by 10.5%, which over standard non-orphan growth is 5.3%, so double that of non-orphan growth. And that's expected in 2020 to account for 176 billion in global sales, and that is just the top 50 orphan drugs. So that's not even, the smaller indications, smaller drugs that you are all working on. The breakdown from a cost perspective, phase 3 orphan drug development, and Bharat and I will take you through some of those numbers, is about half that of non-orphan development, and potentially a quarter of that if you consider the US tax incentives and tax breaks. So it's about $43 million to develop a phase 3 orphan product compared to $188 million. I talk a little bit about the expected ROI being double compared to non-orphan drugs, and then the fact that these phase 3 filed orphan drugs account for about 20% of all R&D phase 3 spend and about 32% of the value creation in the industry. So really the investment community is taking a long, hard look at how they can put their money in this sector and really be able to reap the rewards from a patient use and an economic standpoint. So again, this is Global Gene's lovely drug development map covering basic research and discovery. There's a lot of talk about this gap between basic research, how you move something from academia into drug developers' hands, how you get people interested. Really, this whole concept of the translational research gap was why I founded my orphan drug consulting company about 5 years ago. I realized that there were a lot of companies that they were hiring attorneys to do tech transfer. They were firing them when the in-licensing was done. Then they were hiring a lot of scientific staff and then firing them as soon as they moved on to a development stage company. Hiring development people, doing the same thing when they became a commercial company if they were that fortunate. So there was a lot of kind of discontinuity within a team because of lack of resources, and I thought it'd be great to pull together a bunch of consultants that fit these skill sets and have them work with some of the academic groups, the accelerators, the venture capitalists, and individual contributors, individual funds, to be able to move the concept through basic research and into the hands of drug developers. So Global Genes has identified how patients can share their voices and some of the research tools, and Bharat and I in orange have put together our thoughts on where we think some of the funding is available, and then below that, just some a concept that we were chatting about the other day, how really at the basic research and discovery level, the cost comparison is very similar between orphan and non-orphan. So when you approach an investor, whomever that may be, big or small, and you're talking about developing an indication, it's orphan or non-orphan, really the cost differential it doesn't exist. So you shouldn't be deterred at that stage. It's also a great way to be able to pitch to investors that you're going to spend $3 to $5 million at this stage, $3 to $10 million at this stage, whether you're working on something for a large indication or for a rare disease. So let's get involved in the rare disease space as early as possible. And I'll let Bharat take us through some of the sources of capital here.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. Hey, so I've been involved with rare disease indication R&D for the last 5 years, and it has been just fascinating area to see the growth of this area, especially from a patient advocacy point of view, from the foundations for different types of rare diseases. And a lot of the early stage research funding, in my experience, has been driven by foundations, academic labs, NIH-funded initiatives, venture philanthropy. There's a significant amount of that money going into early basic research, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You have the CHDI for Huntington's disease, for example, or the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's research. There's a lot of those disease foundations and venture philanthropists who are actually contributing significantly to understanding some of the early basic research and discovery aspects of rare disease. In addition to government foundations, if you're thinking about companies, starting a new company, there is a Small Business Administration in the US is a good resource to apply for grants for early stage research. It's not a lot of money, but it gets some of the early stage of proof of concept in cell culture, animal models, going through the SBIR grants. And there are also so-called angel investors out there, high net worth individuals who are also contributing in a significant way towards funding some of these early stage efforts in discovery and development. There's not a whole lot of venture capitalists who get involved at an early stage, unless, of course, it's a potentially breakthrough or a disruptive technology platform that people are focusing on applying it towards rare disease indications. But there is a growing interest now from venture community as well to start getting involved in the early stage based on the valuation. But for the most part, it's really the angel investors, the government grants, the venture philanthropists who are really spearheading and foundations of the diseases. There are also strategic partnerships with large pharmaceutical companies. So they have these companies like Pfizer and Novartis have early stage research entities who actually do get involved in helping some of these early stage efforts in drug discovery and development. Again, not a lot of money, but helps these companies get going and get some of those early proof of concept in animals established.
Great. So I think the only thing I would add to that is similar to the pharma early research initiatives is the venture arm. So a lot of pharma companies, Pfizer, Novartis, really all of them, Merck, have started these venture arms of their business development groups. And the nice thing about that is it does provide access to early stage discovery. It also has, those groups have some nice features in that they're not as limited by capital. They're a little bit more fluid on what the return on investment is, and they're a little bit more fluid on going back to the well to get more capital, meaning, I was meeting with a gentleman the other day who said, well, what's the size of your fund? And he said, Allison, we don't work like that. We don't have a size of our fund. If we see something very cool, we just go back to the mothership and ask them for more money because this fits so well within our scientific mission or within our indication field. So it's an interesting way that they run these arms. Sometimes they're not as large of investments as a traditional venture cap firm, but there's some nice flexibility that's offered there. And I guess the one last point here would be, for smaller amounts of money, Bharat mentioned these government grants. You guys are all familiar with OOPD, the Office of Orphan Products Development. The nice thing about those grants, they only approve about 10% per year of the applications that they receive. So, it's somewhat competitive. But those are recurring grants. So if you get accepted into that program, it's for every year you get 100,000, 200,000, 400,000. It depends on the stage of the research program, the stage of the clinical program, but it supports a lot of the clinical development costs in a very stable and expected way. So that's a nice program there. They also contribute to a lot of the protocol development and assistance along the way, since they've skin in the game. Moving to the next stage, so preclinical research, again, provided by Global Genes, their thoughts on funding. They move into more of the venture philanthropy, industry support, pharma support, and then, again, grants. Bharat and I did some research here where we wanted to compare the preclinical research costs of orphan and non-orphan, and they came out again the same. So back to the point of it, is very cost efficient at this stage to be developing either orphan or non-orphan. So there's not a great deterrent to stay out of that if people are looking at that. So about $5 million to have proof of concept in an animal model at the preclinical stage. I'll let Bharat take us through, expand upon the sources of funding available.
Yeah, a lot of the funding sources are similar for the early stage, as well as you move into animal studies, proof of concept in a disease model. Similarly, government grants are a good resource. The Small Business Administration grants are fairly attractive. As you make progress in your discovery efforts and move towards the animal studies, the size of the grants also goes up accordingly. So that's a good resource. Angel investors continue to invest. At this stage, you have as Allison mentioned, the government OOPD grants and CATs. DARPA is a good resource for some of these preclinical type research studies. Venture capitalists, again, they start getting excited at this stage when you can establish some kind of a preclinical proof of concept that demonstrates that this particular disease pathway or mechanism can actually has the potential to be effective in treating some of these rare diseases. So they do get involved at this stage. Venture philanthropy, again, they are a good source of investment in preclinical research. I've had a lot of experience with, for example, the Michael J. Fox Foundation for Parkinson's research. Also, there is this funding initiative in California, the stem cell research grant, provided there is some connection between some of these treatment options for some of these rare diseases. They do support such research through those grants. Again, the strategic partnerships with pharma companies or large biotechs is a good way to fund some of the research at this stage of development. And as Allison mentioned, the venture arm of the big pharma companies, they do get involved. And like I said, as you make progress through the discovery and move towards preclinical development, the size of the investment also goes up accordingly. And so it's a good way for them to get involved and get funding from these agencies and organizations. One of the attractive features about this pharmaceutical company-based venture capital arm is that they also are in its own way, a validation or at least a demonstration that a pharma company could be interested in the type of research you're doing, which could be a motivation for some other funding agencies like the venture capitalists and others to get involved alongside the pharma companies. So there's some intangible benefits associated with that.
Great, and two comments here about strategic partnerships and venture philanthropy. So my recommendation on venture philanthropy is to select organizations and groups that have a high level of engagement. So really venture philanthropy works on three different scenario levels. People commit small amounts of money for just a study or a basic mechanism of action proof of concept study. Then you have other types of investments where a wealthy endowment will hire a group of individuals that are almost the athletes of each of these functional areas of drug development, and they'll pull them together, and it's really the best of the best that are choosing and developing these products. And then you have more collaborative examples of the foundation, the philanthropy working with the biotech or the pharma company, and that's the Michael J. Fox or the Gates Foundation. And really, my success in working with venture philanthropy is just to get people who are very engaged with what you're doing and who have a mechanism to take what you're working on and put it into their shop. So for us working with the Gates Foundation, we were never going to develop something for sub-Saharan use. That was their main focus. So really complementary desires here for development and for innovation, with a lot of support back and forth across the research lines. On the strategic partnership side, I would only add to what Bharat said by saying choose strategic partners who can provide what we refer to as these in-kind support mechanisms. So you may have a team that can do the basic research, and you may have a clinician who knows the protocol design by heart, because a lot of the clinicians in this space are fabulous. But choose a big pharma company that has these tricky mouse models or has these in vitro or silico models that are in-house and they're willing to perform those studies. It saves a ton of money and time to really partner with a pharma company that's got those, that infrastructure already built. Okay, moving on to clinical research. When a company becomes a clinical stage company, everything can change. The preclinical, this should say clinical, sorry, research cost comparison now becomes very dissimilar for orphan and non-orphan. So I listed the three phases of traditional drug development. We all know that in the orphan space, this is usually 2 phases. However, sometimes the third one is a post-market, or it's a pediatric, or a non-inferiority. So for the sake of just the direct orphan to non-orphan comparison, we left it in here. Phase 1 for non-orphans, 20 million, goes down to 5 million in the orphan space. Phase 2 from 40 to 8, and phase 3 from 188 million down to 43. So very concrete incentives for engaging at this stage. I'll turn it over to Bharat for the sources of capital.
Yeah, and so these numbers in terms of clinical trial costs are actual costs to run the trials. They do not include the overheads and stuff, or the risk-adjusted numbers. And you probably have seen in the popular press, a big pharma company, for example, spends about $1 billion to get a product from idea stage all the way to the market. So, I mean, that number includes a number of other factors like the risk adjustments, the number of drugs that have failed along the way, and eventually, one of them is able to come to the market. So all of the money that's spent along the way, successes as well as failures, is what goes into that $1 billion. So these numbers that you're seeing here for phase 3 and phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 costs for traditional drug discovery and clinical trials is really actual costs of running these trials per patient costs. And so when you go into clinic, the funding opportunities expand quite, in a significant way. You have now access to potentially public markets for access to capital. So when a company is a clinical stage company, assuming the market is open and in terms of the investors either on NASDAQ or New York Stock Exchange, that you're able to position the company for a potential initial public offering where you can actually list the company and raise money in the public markets. So that is a significant opportunity that a lot of the companies, when they reach a clinical stage of development, are able to tap into. So in addition to the public markets, you also have, again, continued access to capital through the foundations. The venture capitalists now are more interested in investing because the risk level has significantly been mitigated once you enter a clinic. You still have a significant clinical risk, but at least you're not taking the discovery and development risk. And so the venture capitalists' appetite to invest in these clinical stage assets goes up quite significantly. And so you get a lot more VCs ready to invest in clinical stage programs. Venture philanthropy, likewise, continues to be active in this area of investment. Then at this clinical stage, a number of pharma companies and large biotechs also get excited because now they're taking in or in licensing or partnering a clinical stage assets that they can then run with if they choose to because they have a lot of expertise in clinical trial development as well as eventual, hopefully, marketing. So they do get involved at the clinical stage of drug development here, and that's a good source of financing or funding, if you want to call it, to advance the program quite rapidly. Again, it depends on the strategy of the company. If it's a single product company and that's the only thing you have in your pipeline, then you may not want to do a strategic partnership at this stage and take it a little further to build more value if you can access capital in other ways so that you're not giving up a lot of value at a phase 1 stage or and do a partnership at a phase 2 or end of phase 2 or in a phase 3 stage where the value of the asset has gone up quite significantly. You can also look at doing some regional deals where you can keep the rights to the US for these clinical trial assets, clinical stage assets, and try and do deals for the European market with a European company or a Japanese company and use the money that you can generate from those partnerships to fund your US development of those assets. So that's also quite attractive, and a number of companies pursue that approach, provided, assuming, of course, that the indication you're pursuing has a global importance and application.
I think something that's very critical at this stage of clinical research is how you're interacting with the agency and the different mechanisms of approval processes that you can apply for and leverage your company with, and also have a potential source of capital. So accelerated approval and priority review, breakthrough therapy designation, et cetera. And Bharat and I talk often about these priority review vouchers. So there's, just last week or the week before, the sale of a priority review voucher that was already going to have accelerated approval and likely breakthrough therapy designation in an indication that was impacting 20 pediatric patients, sold their priority review voucher for $300 million. So it could be a very unexpected source of capital for your company when you would already be in line for these benefits from a regulatory standpoint. So a creative source of funding there. Yeah.
So and once a company is fortunate enough to go past the phase 3 and have a successful phase 3 trial, and you're able to file a new drug application or a BLA with the FDA, then of course, you're in a very different league. You can access capital quite readily if you choose to take the product all the way to the market yourself. And it's really quite attractive, especially in the rare disease and orphan indication area, because the size of the sales organization that's required for example, in the U.S. or North America is relatively small compared to an indication like diabetes or obesity. So the size of the sales organization the small size allows companies that are in the rare disease space to become a fully integrated pharmaceutical company once you have, if you're fortunate enough to get past the phase 3 and into NDA. And so, again, public markets are a great source of funding for expanding your capabilities into a commercial organization. The public investors are quite happy at this point to fund the companies because the risk is essentially mitigated. Now the risk is really commercial success, which again, is relatively small compared to, if you're funding a company at the discovery stage, for example. So you do a lot of payer research. You get access to different markets based on the size of the indication, and you do a lot of that groundwork before you start thinking about building a sales force to launch a product in the U.S. Strategic partnerships also is a creative way of funding some of this sales organization, where you could partner with a large company where you retain the U.S. rights and give up rights to, like, let's say, Europe or Asia, and use that money to really build your sales organization in the U.S. So that way, you're not diluting the shareholders, and you're using non-dilutive ways of funding the sales organization. You can also do co-promote type deals where you're essentially partnering with some sales organization in the U.S. to together join forces to launch the product. And of course, at this stage, the company is a prime target for a potential acquisition by a larger company, and that happens all the time in this field. And I was fortunate to have that happen to Auspex, my previous company, earlier this year, where we were in the rare disease space. We had a successful phase 3 trial. We had gone public about a year ago. We had raised significant amount of capital in the public market, and we were getting ready to file a new drug application in the U.S., and we had significant interest from large pharmaceutical companies wanting to acquire the company, and we ended up being acquired by Teva Pharmaceuticals for a significant premium to the market. So that is an attractive way for the investors to get return on the investment, but also from a patient perspective, it actually bodes well in terms of getting these products to the patients much more rapidly because of the experience and expertise that large companies have in advancing products to the market and distribution and such, that a small company may not have the wherewithal to do that and has to learn along the way in launching a product. So that is an attractive way of getting return on the investment.
So I remember a few years ago, there was a big debate amongst some of the investment community regarding how long the payer structure was going to support these high costs per year per patient in the orphan drug space. And I was in DC and speaking to a congressman who said to me, Allison, there are 3 reasons why no one's ever going to push back against these high prices of orphan drugs. One is that there are so few people on each insurance plan. They're so regionally spread out that an insurance company is not going to deny an individual coverage if they have 3 patients on their plan. Number 2, many of these indications, many of these drugs, there's no alternative. So very bluntly, he said, what am I going to do? Am I going to look at a patient and say, well, it's either, no, we're not going to approve this. Your other option is debilitating, usually fatal disease. He said, so that's just not going to happen. And number 3 is most of these 80% of these indications are in the pediatric space. So a lot of motivation for the investment community to realize that if they're just looking at their return, and if they're just making a purely economical argument for putting their dollars in this field, it's not going anywhere from a price of drugs and a cost of drugs standpoint. So still a very strong argument there. Okay, so I think we can take some questions right now if anybody would like.
Hi, I'm Roberta from the Alagille Syndrome Alliance. So we understand the concept of wanting to get capital venture, venturists or venture capitalists, and working in the strategic market to get funding. But how do you bridge that gap, or how do small organizations bridge that gap between, funding in their small communities, because we all have such small communities and small organizations, to getting to that point, because that's a big struggle for a lot of these organizations. Like, I can see what you're saying, and I understand what you're saying that we should do, but how do we get there? We've got, $50,000 to us is like, oh my gosh, so much money, and it takes a year to earn that. How do we get there? How do we educate our organizations, our board members, to get to the point where we can go there financially? Because our patients can't afford to fund these.
I appreciate that question and the emotion behind it, and it's definitely a challenge. I think that something that I talk about a little bit in this community is something called venture advocacy, which is a term that I don't hear that often, but it's you're struggling with getting people to pay attention at such an early stage, and how to make. There's one conversation about how to make that $50,000 go far, but I think the basic conversation, the more important conversation, is how to start with more than $50,000, right? So this venture advocacy is people approach me all the time saying, how do I get access to firms? How do I get a meeting? How do I just get them to pay attention to me? So my guidance here is to find people who have worked with them, and you need a liaison. Just like every patient needs a medical liaison, every foundation needs a venture liaison and venture advocacy. And these people, and I would say that I'm one of them. I have colleagues who do this very well. These people know the venture community well, and they know the types of deals that they're looking at. So when I take you through the Sunlogic case study and talk to you about that financing, I knew who was out there looking to make a deal in a specific space. And it's going back to that well with something new. So if you have $50,000, what is the pivotal experiment that you can do with that money that will get attention, and spend some of that money paying somebody or giving them options in the future company, or some type of deferred financial incentive to just match make you with somebody who will get you meetings in the right arena. And there are early stage venture capitalist companies. People know who these firms are, where they put in seed money, $300,000 to get some of these studies done, and then they'll build, exercise more of their portfolio as you reach certain milestones. But a lot of these venture firms now like to, obviously they have a low valuation if they can get in early, but also they'll guide you through the process, and they will, start off with things out of a foundation or out of an academic lab and really help you get those studies done and have some significant data at the end of the day to show and to present. So Atlas Venture, Flagship Venture, just 2 firms in Boston, like to get in and put one of their venture partners as acting CEO of this program so that they have oversight of the research and of the financial expenditures. So I think, I really appreciate where you're coming from, and I'm happy to talk offline, but I think it really is getting a liaison to help hook you up with the right folks.
Yeah, one additional thought on that is a lot of the early stage research, it's challenging to really get people's attention, especially if it's a very small indication. But thanks to, I think, the Orphan Drug Act and such in the last 5 years or so, there has been significant awareness and the importance of investing in these, small indications, for example. And so people have been very creative. I have seen people go to, of course, friends and families, but also do crowdsource funding, which we didn't really talk about. There is that internet is quite powerful, Facebook, social media. People go out and talk about these things, and it's amazing how many people actually do end up funding some of these things, especially the early stage work. So.
Hi. So I work with a group out of Washington, D.C. It's a national group that works with family caregivers, and I want to ask for clarification on the last point, and it's possible that I don't want to ruffle feathers, but maybe I misunderstood what you were saying about pricing for rare disease drugs, and about being able to set the prices, at a rate that isn't really challenged. I'm just thinking of, in the last couple of weeks, the news about Daraprim, and I realize that, of course, is a generic, that there was an IP loophole, it wasn't innovation. But I think a lot of patient advocacy groups are struggling to straddle this line, right, where we appreciate that companies need to be able to innovate, to set reasonable prices, to recover R&D, but we also understand that patients and families, the higher the drug price goes, even with co-insurance and copays and deductibles, a higher drug price still means a higher out-of-pocket cost at the end of the line. So I think maybe I misunderstood what you were trying to say, and I'm wondering if you can maybe clarify what you were telling us there.
Sure. So I'm speaking at it from a purely how to get money and how to sell, working on research as having an end game that could be profitable for these insurance companies. So I understand there's a sensitivity between what's covered and what's out of pocket, and what pharmaceuticals are spending on R&D costs to develop a drug for so few individuals. When I talk about the high pricing of orphan drugs, I see it as a potential incentive to the investment community to be able to start working on, the 6,500 diseases that don't have a treatment option, right? If there's 7,500 rare diseases and we have 451 approved drugs, that gap is my main focus in my field. So it's not that I disagree with you. I think that's definitely almost a different topic, is how to help then patients. What does the drug access look like? Is there another way that we can support patients who aren't able to even cover the out-of-pocket costs, and how insurance companies could perhaps increase their coverage in these orphan, it's only 450 drugs. If there's a way to increase the percentage coverage, I think that's a different conversation, but purely from a how to fund this and how to make it the most attractive field to work in is the basis of my comments. Okay, so then moving on to access to capital, the how, what, where, and when. I spoke a little bit in answering a question about the concept of venture advocacy. Bharat and I talked about this high impact networking. So how do you guys go to all of these events and really talk to the right people? And we both believe that it's, again, having that representative who's done this before and who's done it successfully. So who's somebody that's done a really great deal, for instance, Bharat, with a small biotech company, Cerna to Merck, who's made some significant transformational investments and dollars on deals, and get that person to help you network. The what, this phrase that Bharat used, disruptive technologies, I think that's a really hot space. These platform technologies, and then this concept, the pipeline within a product. So having the same compound that can be utilized in multiple orphan indications, still with a significant and strong mechanism of action, but really efficiently building out that pipeline with a single asset. And then the where and the when are a little bit of just a joke everywhere, anywhere, and always. And the secret sauce, I recently spoke about what the secret sauce for getting funding looked like. And last night, Bharat and I came up with timing, positioning, persistence, and luck. And it doesn't seem like anything there is novel, but it's really got to be the coming together of all of these things to be able to adequately source your program.
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on funding for natural history. It's kind of the first step in a lot of rare disease research, and I'm wondering if you found a niche or a group that's more interested in funding natural history.
Yeah, a lot of the, for example, we are at Auspex, we were working on Huntington's disease. And even though the gene for Huntington's disease was discovered in the 90s, and there were like approximately 30,000 patients in the US, to really understand, who those patients are, where they are, the family history, who is, there are about 200,000 carriers of this Huntington's disease gene, and how do you identify them and have a registry of seeing, how many of those potential 200,000 carriers actually got tested, and so that you can somehow figure out a registry, form a registry of these patients who then can participate in this whole drug discovery and development space. So a lot of that funding there are a number of different Huntington's disease groups, for example. They were going out and seeking funding from companies like Auspex to help them build that database, which may not be immediately helpful or useful to the company, but in the long term can be very beneficial to actually doing some follow-on compounds or additional mechanisms of action research in the Huntington's disease space. So you do get funding from some of these biotech companies who are in the space, who may be looking at a very niche type of, maybe a symptomatic treatment for a disease. But then the larger, question is, can you go after the disease progression and treatment? And in that case, you really need the family history and access to that information, which is critical. And so a lot of, I know of a number of small biotechs, as well as large companies who are focusing now on orphan diseases, who do fund some of these initiatives to try and generate that data. And then, of course, the NIH has the Opd Office of the Orphan Drugs. They do have an initiative to collect some of these patient information, family history, to really across different rare diseases that I'm aware of, where you can get some funding grants in the form of grants.
Okay, so then I think the last part of our talk is just moving on to our most recent case studies. So we'll start with Sunlogic. So Sunlogic is a company that received its funding in July of last year. We raised $30 million from NEA, Atlas Venture, and the Gates Foundation. The company was seeded back to this concept of very early stage funding. The company was seeded by Atlas Venture. They put in just a little bit of money to get some initial, not even proof of concept, just to really get some insight into how we would go after the field of synthetic biology meets the microbiome. So really the first 6 months of the company was spent on looking at indications that we'd possibly be able to target. So it was answering questions. This is an orally delivered engineered microbe that is engineered in a way that it completes these complex metabolic conversions of something that's bad for you, a toxic metabolite, turns it into something that is either neutral for you, a benign byproduct, or something that's good for you, something that might be supplemented in that disease state anyway. So really, where would we have toxic metabolite that was present in the gut? Was there a validated animal model? Because it's a new modality. We're engineering bacteria. We wanted to make sure that we had the really great genetic and chemical mouse models. And then how validated were the clinical endpoints? With that set of data, we identified 29 rare diseases that we thought our technology, our disruptive technology, could address, and narrowed that down to 4 internal programs that we're working on, all in inborn errors of metabolism. So this field that I'm talking about, we call it synthetic biotics, and it's this combination of the microbiome, and which is an area that's been around for quite a while. Papers come out every week that talk about how the dysbiosis of the gut regulates almost every other organ and is implicated in so many diseases, from autism to heart failure to oncology, obesity and metabolism, etc. So, this field's incredibly hot right now. We have 4 to 5 pounds of microbiome of bacteria in our body. We thought, let's think about this as leveraging another organ, essentially, and utilizing that as a delivery vehicle to then put in this newer field of biology, synthetic biology, really using switches and timers and memory elements in this concept of biosensing and bioremediation. So I believe it takes the whole notion, which is definitely overplayed, of personalized medicine to a new level where you're able to have a tunable therapeutic response. This was something that I raised money for by taking venture capitalists on the road and saying, let's look at the microbiome space. They were ready to make a microbiome investment. Let's look at that community, and then let's assess, where we think the biggest mover is in that space. And we've had, great success. We have been very capital efficient. So even though we have 4 programs in development and we're moving 2 into the clinic next year, we've always been cost conscious and have spent, about a third of what we raised in a very lean way to make sure that we're protecting our internal resources while we also look for partnerships for larger indications. Our focus we want to maintain is in the rare disease space and in inborn errors of metabolism. So it was a great success story for an early stage concept with not even an in vitro assay that was done when we raised the money. And then I believe we only have about 3 more minutes, so I'll quickly pass it over to Bharat.
So one other point about this is going back to the previous slide about timing. It's really about how you time some of these efforts. Even 5 years ago, if Sunlogic was trying to found this company, trying to raise money, the timing wasn't right at that time because people were really not that aware of, or at least didn't quite appreciate the full potential of a microbiome combination, or the combination of synthetic biology and microbiome using your own gut bacteria to be able to develop new class of therapeutics to treat in a variety of diseases, people would have essentially laughed you out of the room even 5 years ago. But today, it's one of the hardest areas of biomedical research, and so it's really about timing, and there is no magic answer to when is the right time. It's just you'll know it when you see it, right? So timing is really critical, and I think it's important here at Sunlogic.
So timing and persistence. So I worked on an engineered microbiome company 9 years ago, and we had a tough time, making the leap, getting that true capital that we needed to move programs forward. So timing, as Bharat said, but just keeping at it. So that persistence feature as well.
I won't go into this in great detail. Essentially, this is a kind of a horizon slide about Aspects, the company that was recently acquired by Teva. Essentially, when we got started, got involved with this, we were working on Huntington's disease, and it wasn't to treat or delay the progression of Huntington's disease, but it was essentially looking at treating the symptoms of some of the manifestations of Huntington's disease, like the chorea associated with Huntington's disease. And so there was not a lot of awareness at the time when we got involved. We did have a phase 3 trial that had just been initiated, but there was not a lot of buzz about this or the awareness. And the company had about $6 million in the bank and really did not have enough money to complete the trial even though it was a very small phase 3 trial, 90 patients, but even getting those 90 patients enrolled in a population of potentially 30,000 patients was difficult because they were all spread out throughout the country and so on. But we were able to, again, use the logic of, positioning the drug in a way that, captured the imagination of the investors. We were able to raise a significant amount of money through the public markets, through an IPO, and then subsequently through follow-on rounds of financing. So in about 18 months, we raised about $400 million for the company to be able to not only fund the completion of phase 3, but also launch the drug in the US. And we were on our way to doing that when we got an offer from Teva to be acquired. So it's an example of how, working in a rare disease, but potentially an asset that has applications in indications that are beyond just Huntington's, but also Tourette's and tardive that helped us generate the value. So we'll stop there. I think we're over time. Great, thank you.
Please, I'd just like to thank Allison and Bharat for leading this discussion this afternoon. Really fascinating.